All right. Well, Barry, thank you so much for setting this up and for introducing me. And I'm so thankful and grateful for Interface for having me this month. And I so appreciate you all being here and wanting to, get in this discussion and dialogue about how to support grieving children and families. As we get started, I just want to note too that Interface is recording this presentation. So you're welcome to jump in with questions or anything that you'd like to ask at any time, but please know that this is also being recorded. So just, share whatever you feel best sharing for yourself, knowing that. To expand on the introduction a little bit, I just want to share a little bit more about myself as we get started. My name is Brian Keating, and I got my master's degree from Naropa University in contemplative psychotherapy, and I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado. I do belong to a few different organizations that I will be referencing throughout the presentation and also identifying as resources at the end as well. I'm a community pathfinders provider through Judy's House JAG Institute, which means that as a previous staff member there, I'm able to use their grief and bereavement curriculum with clients in my private practice. I'm also on the advisory board for Camp Kesem of University of Colorado Boulder, which I will speak to more, but they provide free services to children whose parents have a cancer diagnosis or are deceased from cancer. I'm also a member of the Grief Support Network as a community provider there, and a member of the Second Wind Fund of Boulder County, which I will share more about at the end as well. I use he, him, his pronouns, and what I will be speaking about today are things that I've learned from working in the field of grief and bereavement, both from leaders in the field and then also my direct work with children, adults, and families. I'll be referencing some notes that I have on the side over here, just to make sure that I'm on track for our time together. But please feel welcome to jump in if you have questions. I'm not going to monitor the chat, Barry. I found it was distracting for me to have up on the screen. So just jump in if anyone has a question or a comment that they want to add through the chat. So to give you an idea of the outline for our time together today, I'll be sharing information about grief and bereavement, and specifically how that relates to grieving children and the families that support those children. I'll also talk about how we can adapt supporting grieving children in the time of this pandemic, and how the physical distancing might be impacting grieving children and families. I also invite you to check in with yourself throughout this process and be kind to yourself, knowing that grief and bereavement is such a universal concept and experience that many of the things we discuss or touch on today may start to feel personal for you, or they might trigger old feelings or memories. So please take care of yourself in whatever way feels comfortable. You're welcome to shut off your video screen if you want to do some stretching or walk around or get a drink, or if you want to have your screen on, that's okay too. But the idea is to just be gentle with yourself, knowing that sometimes when we enter into these conversations, it might bring up some things that you might not have known were there as we first started. So as we begin, I like to share a story about Abraham Lincoln. And this is something that comes from the book Borrowed Narratives, which is by Harold Ivan Smith. And I think it's important to share because when we talk about grieving children, we're talking about the experiences they have as children, and then also look at the adults that they'll become, in the idea of resiliency and how to move along with their losses. So with Abraham Lincoln, there are many things we know about him. He was the 16th president. He was tall, maybe good with an axe. And some things that we also might know a little bit about are the ideas that he experienced a lot of death throughout his childhood and as an adult. His mother died, his two sons died, and his sister died while giving childbirth. And something that isn't as widely known about Abraham Lincoln is that he was the first president to bring a piano into the White House. And the reason being is that he learned throughout his childhood and as he became an adult that his experiences of grief and those feelings attached to that could come up at any time and could be really overwhelming. And so he found that listening to music was helpful for him. And of course, back then there weren't phones or streaming services or any ways of accessing music other than listening to someone play the piano or another instrument. So he found that going into the White House as president, it was important for him to have a piano player on staff and to have a piano available, so that as he was going about his presidential duties, if something happened where maybe it was a reminder of someone's death or a reminder of a person that he felt connected to, that when those emotions or feelings came up, that he could go into the room and listen to the piano player and be with his grief in whatever way felt best for him. And then when he was ready, he could go back to his presidential duties. I like to share that because it also normalizes that grief is something that is so universal to the human experience, and that all things that are living will die, and that we will grieve those losses in different ways. It feels important for me to speak about childhood bereavement because it's something that is often unacknowledged or unrecognized. And some of the studies that have come out through Judy's House and JAG Institute really identifies how impactful death loss is for children. In their childhood bereavement estimation model, it shows that 1 out of 14 children nationally will experience the death of a parent or a sibling before the age of 18. And in Colorado, that's 1 out of 16 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling before the age of 18. And in a recent study that was published in mid-April from the Committee on Applied Demography, it's showing that for every death due to the coronavirus and COVID-19, there'll be 2.2 children that are bereaved, which also leads to 4.1 grandchildren that will be experiencing grief due to the loss of someone in their life that they had a relationship to. When we talk about grief in this way, it can be helpful to pull apart what grief means or what it might be. And the way that I relate to grief and some meanings that have been helpful for me is to pull it apart as the thoughts, feelings and emotions, the body reactions and behaviors that we have when someone dies. And so that really looks at the whole body, whole being experience of what happens when we experience a death loss. And if we were in person right now, I might open this up to a larger exercise or a discussion. Because oftentimes when we start talking about grief, there are a lot of what Alan Wolfelt might call grief myths, or the ideas that phrases or ideas that we hold on to that might not be true for everyone in grief. And so what I'd like to do to make this interactive in some way, if it feels comfortable for people, is I have a hat right here with some things thrown in them. And I'm just going to reach in and kind of see what I have and see if there's anything that people want to address or speak to. So the first one is that children who have experienced a death loss grow up to be adults that might have unhelpful coping skills or might be impacted in a negative way. Are there any thoughts about that?
Sounds true.
I think it would make you feel more calloused.
I think personally that it depends on how it's handled. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, hi, Kim.
Hi. I think it depends on how it's addressed.
Yeah. Yes, that could be the idea that a child might feel more calloused. Then also if there's support and structure and an empathetic environment that they could adjust in a healthy way. And I think that is evident in the story with Abraham Lincoln, that he was able to work out for himself what was helpful, ways that he could adjust to that loss as he became an adult. It also speaks to the idea of post-traumatic growth, in that children can become stronger after hard experiences. So I'll circle back to that towards the end as well.
Brian?
Yes.
You haven't mentioned that Abraham Lincoln experienced depression as an adult.
Yeah. What do you make of that?
Well, that could be a result of grieving. It could be.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, it brings up the question of how could you not be impacted by all those losses?
Well, I'm sure he was.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing that in.
I don't think it's an issue of how could someone be impacted. I mean, they have to be impacted. And it's a question of how they're working that out. With my mom, I thought about Rocky Flats because I can't prove it, but she died of leukemia, and that is probably why.
Yeah.
And I got in the healthcare field because I wanted to make it right.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like you were able to make some meaning of that in wanting to go towards the healthcare field.
I mean, Lincoln went to the piano,
Yeah.
and I can understand that too, because music is very.
Yeah, we all find different things that we might be drawn to and go towards.
Yeah, I could say that as well, that my mother's suicide is what got me into the field of mental health and psychotherapy.
Yeah. I so appreciate you all jumping in and lending your voices and personal experiences too. I'm going to reach in and draw another topic. So this one is, children are too young to understand the idea of death. or grief.
Butter, cantaloupe, Lay's potato chips.
And I had a break in the connection on my end. I didn't quite catch that.
I heard
Yes.
Lay's potato chips.
Yeah. So the one that says that has the Planters, peanuts, and the Cheetos, that was last time. Or that was previously, and I tried to I found it and I tried to modify it and bring it up to. Correct.
Karen, it sounds like your mic is on.
Okay, so am I going to get sliced turkey breast?
So I can mute everybody, but I thought, Brian, that you were asking for comments. So
Yeah.
unmuted everyone.
Yeah.
I have a response.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
I think that adults are too.
Okay, so we have like 11
Barry,
items
you
and the
can
totals are like
mute
32
Karen
something. 32,
individually.
72?
Okay.
There. I feel like when you say that children are too young to understand, I feel adults are too old to understand. I think from your past life, when you've come in, I think you're very able to understand a lot more than adults give you credit for.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Unmute us. Hello. Hi. This is Helene Unger. I'm Jed Shapiro's partner. And I had a child who was 6 years old when her father died. And though she might not understand the whole concept of death, she clearly understood the idea that he would never be back.
Yeah.
So it was, you know, that is sort of a concept of death, I would venture to say, right? That somebody, you will never see that person again.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
anyway, I thought I'd put that in there.
Yeah. Thank you, Helena.
Brian, this is Paul Roddy.
Hi, Paul.
I've been aware that friends of mine whose dogs have died, and they've decided it was a good idea to bury the animal and have the kids there. And actually the children took over the service in a sense, because they not only understood it, but they understood that some sort of ritual or something needed to be put in place.
Yes. Yeah, and I can hear that connecting to what Lynn shared too about children almost having that born awareness and instinct to follow that.
I think when you assign a silence to something, you leave it up to the imagination of the child and it makes it bad. There must be something wrong with this because they're not talking about it.
Yeah. And with children, we know that their worlds can be so small, but their imaginations can be so big and so wide. And that without having some sort of concrete understanding or framework or ritual, that they can start to create things that might be unhelpful for them, or even hurtful or harmful. And those are things I will circle back to in just a bit as well. Another grief myth that often comes up is the idea of stages of grief. And that is something in my work with bereaved children that in their families that I don't follow the idea of stages of grief. There is some belief that when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with that model, that it was speaking specifically to patients that were dying and not actually the bereaved. And what we found is that so often grief doesn't go in stages, that it can be circular, or messy. And it's not a straight line or a straight process. So in working with children, one of the things that I like to hold on to is similar to Warden's 4 tasks of grieving, or the idea that it's important to accept the loss and have an understanding of it, while also allowing space for exploration on the experience of the death, on the relationship with that person, all the changes that happened afterwards. And then adjusting to what that future looks like moving forward. How can the kids continue to have a relationship with this person or people in their life as they get older? How will they find meaning in their journey? I also hold on to the idea of the dual process model, which means that people can be hurting and healing simultaneously. And an analogy I use for that is the idea of being in a raft that's floating down a river, and there's 2 sides, there's 2 riverbanks. And it can be easy to get stuck on either side. And it can be important and helpful to know that that's not the only side. That there might be a lot of moments of joy and happiness while you're grieving, along with those moments of sorrow or anger or fear. I also think it can be helpful to acknowledge the idea of grief waves. That grief can come in bursts of energy like the ocean. And like the ocean, there might be times when we're looking at the waves coming in, and we can prepare for these things. We might get the idea that a big wave is coming towards us. And that could be an event that we see coming up, like a person's birthday or graduation, or anything where you know ahead of time there might be a lot of emotion coming towards us. And there can also be the waves that happen when our back is towards the ocean, and we might not see a grief reminder coming up. I know for some teenagers, that could be reminders that come up on social media, where they're going about their day and everything feels really good for them. And then all of a sudden, social media reminds them of something that happened a year ago, a picture with their person. Or for younger kiddos, they might be in the classroom and a teacher reads a book that their person used to read to them. And that was something that they weren't expecting or that they didn't see coming. And all of a sudden they're filled with all this emotion. So those are things that I think can be helpful to bring into the discussion in the work with children. And I also think it can be helpful to bring in the idea of the brain and how the brain and body and nervous system responds when there's a death loss. So many of you here might be familiar with this, but I like to share it as well, just to keep it in the conversation. Dr. Dan Siegel has a great demonstration of a simplified view of how the brain looks if we make a fist like that in the different parts of it. So he'll say that the back of our fist or our wrist represents the brainstem and the spinal cord and those things that we don't really have awareness of. Maybe our digestion, body temperature, blood flow. And then we have the middle part of our brain there, which is our limbic system, or the emotional part of the brain. And that's where our emotions are stored, and also where our nervous system responses live. So the idea that we might have fight, flight, freeze responses, or fawn or collapse responses can come out of that middle area of the brain. And then when we put our fingers on top, there's the cortex and prefrontal cortex part of our brain that kind of sits in our head like that. And so that's the part of our brain that helps make understanding or put pieces together or give narrative to our experience. And I like to share this when talking about childhood bereavement, because when children experience a death, they get the message that the world is an unsafe or unpredictable place. That how their life was at one moment and one day is all of a sudden very different. And when that happens, that triggers an emotional response. As Dr. Dan Siegel will say, the lid is flipped. And they might have those fight, flight, or freeze responses, or the fawn or collapse responses. So what that can look like is children who become more aggressive, or they might have a lot more energy coming up. Or on the fawn or collapse side, they might be more forgetful, and all of a sudden they're forgetting homework assignments. Or I hear from parents a lot that all of a sudden teenagers might be, leaving a bowl of cereal in strange places. And also when we talk about grief waves, there are also those things that can trigger those responses. And they might be seemingly related to the death or to grief. Like the example of a child in school hearing a book that someone read. Or perhaps a teenager that drives by a place that reminds them of their person. Oftentimes, kids might experience those nervous system responses with separation. So a parent or caregiver that used to travel a lot, and the child might have been okay with that. And now all of a sudden after the death, when the parent travels, there's a lot more emotion coming up. And those can all be common experiences. Again, going back to the idea that grief can be the thoughts, the feelings and the emotions, the body reactions and the behaviors that can come up for kiddos. There might be increased worries or trouble concentrating, or even what might be called ADHD symptoms, where at school they're much more restless and having that trouble concentrating in class. There might be a lot more anger, anxieties, and worries, or maybe even relief. There might be the body reactions and more somatic complaints that come up. Kiddos might be getting headaches or stomach aches more often. And then those behaviors could change. For teenagers, it might be that they're not wanting to see their friends as much. Or perhaps they've lost interest in a sport. Or younger children might feel like they're more attached to their parents or caregivers. And those are all things that can be common. I want to reference some things that we can expect to see for different ages. Typically for children 2 and under, they acknowledge death as the idea of separation. And they don't have a concrete understanding that death is permanent. They just have the idea that something is missing, something is gone. And it can be important at that age to avoid any confusing language. It can be important to stick to concrete terms. Also, keeping routine can be so important. And having that schedule that they can depend on in whatever way feels right for their little brains and bodies. Children around 5 years old might start to develop magical thinking, or the idea that they know their person has died, but that perhaps death might be reversible, or that the person might just be sleeping and that they can come back. And so for kiddos around that age, there can be a lot of confusion and even fears as well. There can be increased somatic complaints or physical sensations, maybe even nightmares. Sometimes what's common to see is that grief can be what I've heard phrased once as jumping in and out of puddles for kiddos at that age, where their grief can come fast and then they move through it, and that's okay. Around 9 years old, children become more aware of the permanence of death. And they also become more aware of what the death is like to them in relation to their peers. So they might not want their friends to know. And they might also want to have an idea of autonomy about how they engage in rituals or any end-of-life process. It can also be helpful to have discussions with them at that age around how they would like others in their life to know. Is it something that they would like their teacher to know? And would they want their teacher to announce it to the class or to keep it private? Going back to the idea of the response or the experience of the death and the flipping the lid, I've often worked with kids who have been in class when their teachers have made an announcement to their classmates that their parent or sibling had died. And that ended up being a grief trigger because they didn't want their friends to know. They didn't want their classmates to know. And all of a sudden they felt like it was something they didn't have control of. Finding physical outlets can be so helpful for kiddos at that age. And also having the adults in their life begin to model feelings can also be helpful. When we talk about that brain experience, Dr. Dan Siegel has that phrase, name it to tame it. So helping kids put words to their emotions or their experiences can help them start to choose different behaviors as opposed to having reactive responses. When kiddos or teenagers reach adolescence, they might start to have more irritability, and they might be seeking support from their peers more, and that's okay. Oftentimes parents might say, they never talk to me about it, and I don't think he or she is grieving. And at that age, it can be developmentally appropriate for them to keep that away from the adults in their lives, but go more towards their peers for that support. And then also around that time, in older adolescents, maybe 13 and older, they might start to have a wider abstract view and more reflective process of their experience of grief and the death. They might be exploring themes of guilt or remorse. Something to watch out for could be risky behavior in ways that they're coping in a way that isn't helpful for them or that is even harmful. In considering the idea of grieving children, it can be helpful to remember that play is how children process. And for teenagers, that play can mean video games. And so even if a teenager isn't talking about it, they might be processing through their play of video games. And they might be able to have social connections with people online that don't know that they've experienced a death. And again, that's something that they feel they have control of. Also, some pieces to consider are cultural considerations for the kiddos. Not be okay to say the name of the deceased. For others, that might be okay. Also, for teenagers, there's been some studies that have shown that people that identify as male might have a reduction in prolactin after puberty, or the hormone that might facilitate tears. So they might not be able to cry as much, and that's okay. Or they might have more difficulty putting words to their experiences, and that's okay as well. Also, before we open it up for discussion around this, I also want to talk to the importance of having concrete language around death and dying. And the idea that it can be so important for all family members to have a true cause of death understanding. There's a website called What's Your Grief that had a great article on the idea that there's 200 euphemisms that are out in our language for how to talk about death and dying. And for younger kiddos, that language that's not concrete can be really confusing. If they're told that their person is in a better place right now, they might want to go to that better place. And they might be working so hard to find a way to get there. Or they might hear that their person is an angel. And they might want to find a way to die so that they can be an angel too. And it's okay to use that wording, just as long as they know that what dead and dying means is that you can't come back. And that when something dies, that it can't come back. And so that can help with that idea of magical thinking. One way to explain it might be to say that when someone dies, their heart stops beating. And when the heart stops beating, the brain stops working. And you can't run or jump or walk anymore. And you can't feel things. And that when someone's heart stops beating, they're dead and they can't come back. And so there's the idea that death is when your body stops working. Also, something that comes up a lot are questions around how to explain different types of death, which can be so hard. Because as adults, it can take us by surprise. All of a sudden, a 9-year-old or a teenager might have a question when we're not expecting it. Maybe we're in the car or driving or making dinner. And they might ask, what's suicide? Did my person die from suicide? Or what is addiction or an overdose? Or what is cancer? And in those situations, again, it can be so important to have concrete language that's also developmentally appropriate. And it can be so important for all family members to have that understanding, because that can also be a threat to the brain. Lisa Dion, who is the founder of synergetic play therapy, has identified that kids can react, their nervous systems can react when they experience 4 threats to the brain: a physical threat, or the brain and body, physical threat, the threat of the unknown, incongruence with the adults in their lives, or even expectations. And I bring that in because I've worked with a lot of families where there might be a certain cause of death, and the teenager and adults might know what happened, and the 7-year-old might not. And they can sense that incongruence, that something just isn't right, that something is off. And knowing that their brains and their worlds are so big, their imaginations, they might even think that zombies came and got their person. And so then they start having fears that that might happen to them. So for these conversations, with cancer, we might say something to the effect that our bodies are made up of all different types of cells. And cancer is when these cells get really sick and it makes our bodies stop working. And sometimes medicine and treatment can help and be helpful, and sometimes it isn't, and the person dies. In explaining an overdose, it could be an overdose is when someone takes too much of a certain medicine or drug and it makes their body stop working. And it can also be helpful to be specific in that case. So they might say the person drank too much alcohol and alcohol made their body stop working. Or if that doesn't feel comfortable, or if it was an overdose with prescription medication, you might say the person took too much medicine and made their body stop working. And medicine is okay for you to take if it's prescribed by your doctor and you take it as you should and you take the right amounts. Or oftentimes with overdose, there's also the topic or discussion of addiction. And so some language might be, addiction is something that happens in someone's brain that wants them to take, or that tells them to take more and more pills or of a drug or alcohol. For suicide, you might say suicide is when someone makes their own body stop working. Some people might have a mental illness that makes their brain not work properly. And they choose to make their body stop working. And for some kiddos, that information is enough. And they say, okay. It can also be helpful to say that suicide is never a choice, never a valid choice for you. And that you can talk to me if you feel upset. And that oftentimes people who suicide or die by suicide have a lot of different things going on, and it wasn't your fault. And nothing you said or did made them kill themselves. And what can be so important in these conversations too is to open it up to see if there's questions. There's the idea that if a child is old enough to ask a question, then they're old enough to get an answer. And so for some kiddos, hearing that the death was a suicide and that the person chose to make their body stop working might be enough. But then they might ask, how did they make their body stop working? And again, having concrete but developmentally appropriate and specific languaging could be helpful there. We want to be mindful and aware of things that might be too graphic or too triggering. And so some language I've used in the past could have been, they used a rope to make themselves stop breathing. Or they used a gun to make their body stop working. And oftentimes that's enough information. And again, having this conversation around all family members of all ages can be so helpful, so that then there are those congruent responses. And that when the kiddo sees an adult or their older sibling upset over something, they know what it might be, or that they can have a conversation around it. Also, what can be important to recognize is that as children get older, they experience different grief reactions based on their developmental stages. So a child who is 5 and hears that their person died by suicide might be okay with that amount of information. But then when they become a teenager, they might start asking more questions and wanting to know more, perhaps where their person was. And those are all things that can be supported. Oftentimes, the children might have questions unrelated to the experience of the death. They might ask, well, who's going to take me to baseball practice now? Or who's going to pick me up after school? Or does that mean we have to sell the house? Or are we still going to go on that vacation we planned? And all those things are okay too. Those are ways that children might be checking their environment for safety and knowing that after experiencing this unexpected news, that things in their life can still go on as they imagined. What can be so helpful is having that safe place to express these feelings. Having different outlets and different ways to express their grief. And this also speaks to that idea that we brought in of post-traumatic growth. that children that experience hard events can also come through it as stronger adults and be more empathetic and learn more about themselves along the ways. I want to pause here as we're about an hour in and just check to see how everyone's doing and what's coming up. I saw that there were some things coming in the chat, but I have it turned off, so I wasn't reading what was being sent in. I wanted to see if anyone had any questions or comments or feedback so far.
Well, I'll just start and say that I found it helpful for you to give examples of being able to be specific in the developmental stage language, depending on how old the kids are. That it's, I think parents may not realize in the time of their own grief what the kids' needs are, let alone as therapists. And so we have a dual responsibility if we're working directly with kids to be able to follow your leads and your examples, but also for families to guide other adults to understand what the kids' needs are and how to best communicate. So your examples are good reminders about the age-appropriate kind of way of communicating and staying in touch.
Yeah, and something that came to mind when you shared that, Barry, is also the idea that parents or adults might say, well, I don't want to tell them now. They're not going to know. I'm going to wait until they're 18 or so. And, we're just not going to tell them. But they can find out in so many other ways. And so,
I'm thinking of the clients of mine as adults, when I asked them what was their experience when their own parent died when they were a child, they say, well, nobody talked to me, or there was no place to go, or everyone was crying and I didn't know what to do. There was nobody there. So how often do we counsel adults who missed an appropriate way of handling grief, and remembering that the child's experience is very important.
Yeah.
I see some heads nodding. I bet other therapists have the same idea, the same experience, I mean.
I was also thinking that the remaining parent is certainly in a compromised position as far as being able to respond to what the kid needs.
Yes, Don, thank you so much for bringing that in. That's something that I've seen a lot with teenagers, especially, where typically they might have a more secure attachment with one parent versus the other. And if the deceased is their secure attachment figure, all of a sudden the other parent is left to figure out how to engage in a relationship now. And I hate to stick with specific genders, but something that I've just seen is that all of a sudden moms might be asked to play football with their sons, or dads are faced with not knowing how to talk to their daughter about buying a prom dress or shopping for different clothing items, or even just not having any communication at all. And that's something I found attachment-based family therapy really helpful and important for, because it can really open up that conversation.
And it's also at the time that the remaining parent is probably falling apart.
Yes, yeah.
Not coping well.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah. And something that I've heard often with that is family members will say, the child might say, well, I don't want to make it harder for my parent, or I don't want to make them more sad. And then the parent will say, well, I'd talk to them about it, but I don't want to make them more sad, or I don't want to make them cry. And what happens is it puts this rift in the separation where the family has already experienced this death and this tragic loss. And by staying separate, they're just having those tears or sadness in isolation. And I really encourage them to come together so that they can share those experiences with each other.
I wonder if you could entertain the idea of if one family member gets COVID and other family members don't, or if one gets it and the others get it and they have different symptoms, or I read about a family yesterday, the whole family got it, and the father going to work in the elevator, the whole office building was very secure and clean, but in the elevator, and everyone got it in the family, and they recovered after 2 weeks, but their symptoms were so varied, and it must have been so disturbing and confusing for all of them.
Yeah.
They had, some of them were just sleeping constantly, needed to sleep 16 hours a day. Some had the cough, some had the dry cough, some had, they couldn't smell, or, you know, the senses, sensory loss. All of that confusion of wondering if it was going to get worse or not, or that seems like a huge dynamic. That was just one story I heard.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a unique experience to the time that we're living in right now. Not only for the family members, but then also acknowledging that there's so much unknown and so many different symptoms that are coming up with the virus.
So, Brian,
Yes.
I've noticed that families that are hardest to deal with are families that didn't speak a lot about feelings prior to the death. And then now there's been a death and they really don't know how to talk about it because they haven't been in the world of feelings themselves, talking about feelings.
Yeah.
So that takes a lot more work as a therapist to deal with a family like that.
Yes. How do you work with that?
Well, just slowly, I guess, helping people to put words to their feelings, to share with them that it's good to talk about these things and express about them. And it just takes longer if you've had a family that isn't used to speaking about feelings.
Yeah. Something I use as an intervention with kiddos that then I think translates and relates really well to the adults in the family too that address that is the idea of rocks in a backpack, where and you can even do it as a like a hands-on exercise where you get like a backpack or a bag and put rocks in it, and each rock has a feeling or an emotion on it. And I'll say, you know, what would it be like to carry this backpack around all day, or all week, or all month? And they might say, oh, well, it feels really heavy, you know, or it'd be uncomfortable. And then I might say, what would it be like to go to sleep with this on? And sometimes teenagers will be like, oh, I don't know, I just move it to the side, or, you know, and that's like, yeah, but, you know, you still have to do something with it, and it is different than what you would want. And then I'll ask them to start taking the rocks out. And they might grab a rock that says anger. And I'll say, okay, could you speak to, you know, is there anger in your grief? And then I'll also have, you know, just whole different emotions, and also joy and relief, which I think is important to put in there. Because so often that's something that is so hard for families to give voice to. And it might be so true to their experience. If someone was really suffering or struggle, or if someone had mental challenges that put a lot of strain on the family. But then the idea is that they can pull out these rocks, and then we pass around the backpack again, and they notice that it's a lot lighter. And so it's the idea of like, this is how they can start to touch in on things and then get it out as well. And that's something that they've done at Judy's house, and then also the Hazelden Betty Ford program uses that with their kiddos.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
But yeah, that's such a challenge, because the grief really does shine a light on an area that might have been unaddressed for the family system, which could be truth and honesty. And if I know for families that are grieving a death loss due to addiction or overdose, all of a sudden the elephant in the room might be the person's substance use that might have never been talked about before. And yet every family member had an experience of that. Another intervention I use with kiddos with that idea is a balloon. And I'll blow into the balloon and ask them to name me feelings that they might be holding inside. And then of course the balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they start getting all excited because it's either going to pop or it's going to blow around. And I'll even let that go. And I'll say that's sometimes what might happen to us when we hold all these feelings in. And then to introduce the idea of coping skills, and to branch out the coping skills along the thoughts, feelings, body reactions, and behaviors, I'll blow up the balloon again with all those emotions. So maybe worries, anger, relief, nightmares, whatever it is that they feel like they're holding inside. And then I'll ask them, what's something that you do to help you feel better when you're angry? And they might say, squeeze Play-Doh, and then I'll let the air out a little bit. And then gradually do that until all the air is out of the balloon. And so I'll explain that with kiddos, but then also I find in working with the family system, as I share that to the adults and like parent coaching, that then it helps them have an understanding of like, oh yeah, like I've been blowing in my balloon too. And that might be things that happen, you know, because of the added stress of coronavirus, or daily stresses of work, or even their own grief reactions. And then they realize that they might get home and all of a sudden their balloon is let out and it flies all over the place. So that's just another way of bringing that in with families.
Other thoughts,
So,
questions, ideas?
I can also transition to specific things that I've seen coming up with coronavirus now. And these aren't things that I've experienced specifically in my practice, but it seems like in the larger community, you know, there's the idea of how do we engage in ritual, and how do we have closure or mourning when we can't be in physical proximity. And something that I really appreciate is the phrase physical distancing versus social distancing. So even though we might not be physically together or in the room at an interface gathering, we're still here being social. And I've seen some reports that having memorial services over Zoom or online have brought a different level of connection and closeness because of the idea of everyone's face being on the screen. Where rather than perhaps having heads down and avoiding one another, or the challenges of like physical proximity that happens at a large event, now all of a sudden people's faces and eyes are connected to each other as they're mourning. It can also be a good time to utilize snail mail again and grasp onto the idea that we can create bigger space around small gestures. So the importance of a handwritten letter or artwork. And I think what can be helpful in slowing things down like that is so often after a death, there might be this public outpouring for the first couple weeks. And then people that aren't as close to the family, or even extended family members or close family members, might then just kind of go back to normal. Yet for the people who are most affected by the death, it's never going to be normal. And so having something that arrives a month later or 2 months later can be so meaningful, because that's typically at a time when other support is pulled away, when the casseroles stop coming. And so this can be an opportunity to engage in a slower way of staying connected that can actually be helpful. Also, the idea of staying connected and staying social over timed rituals can be helpful. So many of us might have seen that with the howling that happens every night at 8 o'clock in honor of the frontline workers. So families could say, every night at 5 o'clock, we're going to light a candle. And know that everyone in their family system or friends or whoever was connected to this person can choose to do that at that time. And it's also something that, of course, you can opt in or opt out, and there's no pressure. And that reminds me that something similar to that is actually happening tonight, sponsored by Judy's House and the National Alliance for Grieving Children, where they're having a, if you go to the judyshouse.org website, you can download a candle, like an art piece, and you can design it and create it for the person or people that you're grieving and put it up in your window for others to see. And then you can take a picture of it and post it to social media. So all ways that you can engage in that process. Some things that I hear coming up are that children are worried that their person was alone in the hospital when they died because we couldn't go see them. So some suggestions for that, of course, always validating those emotions and always validating those concerns. But then also saying something to the effect of, they love you very much and they don't want you to get sick by being around sick people at the hospital. In that the hospital has workers there to make sure that your person won't be alone. And what comes to mind for me is the Mr. Rogers quote of, look for the helpers. And so if a child is having a lot of concern with that, of fears that their person was alone, helping them identify perhaps all the hospital workers that are working right now that are there helping their person and being with them. There's also the concern that they didn't get to say goodbye. They weren't at the bedside, or whatever the circumstances were. Something that could be helpful is the idea of a goodbye box. So like an egg carton or a tissue box or shoebox or whatever, where every night or during the day, the child could write messages of what they want to say as a goodbye and put it in the box. And something that strengthens that is the children's book, The Invisible String. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's such a beautiful children's story about an invisible string that connects us to the people that we love and that we care about and want to be connected to. And it names pets, and it names friends, and it names people that have died and are in heaven or other places, or even someone that might be an astronaut or a deep sea diver. And the idea that we have this invisible string that connects us to them. And that even when they're dead and deceased, we can still have a relationship and connection to them. And that every time we think of them and feel them in our heart, that's like tugging on the string and letting them know that we're thinking about them. So it could also be having a shrine or memorial space in the house and having the child pick out positive objects that are important to them to put up there. And they can say goodbye to that at night. And for some children, that might be triggering, and that's okay too. So it might be having a place where it's removed and then giving them the choice. Do you want to see that tonight? Or do you want to see that this morning? And if they say no, that's okay. But they know that they have control over that in the household when we can't be other places. This was something that I think also came up in the idea of the family that was all experiencing the effects of the virus. But there's the fears that someone else might get sick or that they might get sick. So there's the idea of limiting media exposure and letting them know that most people who get this get better and that children especially get better too. Also, it's normal to have upsetting or scary thoughts that come up at bedtime as the fear is more active in them. So finding ways to get energy out or to have a distraction. Or perhaps work with the thoughts by, similar to the goodbye box, having a worry box that they can write their worries in or write their worries down and rip them up. Or even having a worry doll, something that they can whisper their worries to. Distracting things like homemade Play-Doh that has essential oils in it can be really helpful too, where they can squeeze it out, get that physical release, and then smell it as well. And then also, if there's bubbles at the house, worry bubbles can be a really fun way to end the night, where you can blow bubbles, and that helps with the breathing too. So you're prompting the directive intentional exhalation, and then for each bubble that goes out, identify that as a worry. And then they can even pop it. And then before we open it up again, I want to end with one last anecdote. And this one is about Michael Jordan. And I know that he's coming back into attention, and I might be dating myself here too, but this might be coming back into attention as his new documentary, The Last Dance, is out. But something that comes up that I think is so relevant to the idea of finding these coping skills or finding new things during this time of being home and being physically distant is that when Michael Jordan was at the height of his career, his father was murdered. And he had such a close relationship with his father. And that was also around the time when he made the switch to play baseball. And so both of those things were really big in the media and during interviews. And so he would give an interview about his new baseball team or the career switch, and someone might say, how can you be playing baseball right now? Shouldn't you be grieving? Or your father died, like, shouldn't you be worried about that or sad about that? And a response that he had that I thought was so beautiful and timely to this is that he would say, baseball was my dad's favorite sport. And that when he's playing baseball, regardless of his performance level, it was a way for him to honor his dad and to stay connected to him. So finding those activities for the kiddos that they might be able to do at home that help them stay connected. But then also something else came out that I thought was really relevant. So that he had shared once that for the first time in his career, he had trouble sleeping at night. So after years and years and years of travel and staying in hotel rooms and being on the road with the Bulls, he all of a sudden would wake up at 1, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and not be able to sleep before a big baseball game. And that was all new to him. And he was thinking about his dad and thinking about his grief. And he said that at that point in his life, he decided to try crossword puzzles. And for him, that new routine and that new coping skill, working with the thoughts of his grief and that distraction was so helpful to him to fall asleep. And so that's something that we can do to help the kiddos as well, which I know so many families and parents are already doing. But finding ways to bring in new routines, new rituals, try something new. And that all of these things are workable. All of the thoughts, all of the emotions, the body sensations and the behaviors. And that coming together as families and as helpers in the community, as neighbors and friends, and even as caring strangers, can give these grieving children the support that they need to thrive and to become the people they want to be. I'd also like to share some resources if anyone's wondering of how to help people that they're thinking of right now. So as I've mentioned, there's Judy's House JAG Institute in Denver, which provides bereavement support for children and families at no cost. In Boulder, we have the Grief Support Network, which provides yoga services, mind-body services, retreats, and also peer support for the adults, which I think is so important. I know, and I forget people's names, so I apologize, but I know someone mentioned the idea of like the adults also struggling alongside their children. And so there's the analogy of putting on the oxygen mask, or the idea that you can't pour from an empty cup. And so getting that peer support or doing those things for yourself, like the yoga practice in community, can be so helpful. Also, Camp Kesem is a national organization that provides a week of camp at no cost in the summer to children whose parents either have a diagnosis of cancer, are in remittance, or have died from a cancer diagnosis. It is an amazing organization. And something that's so great about that is once the children get in one year, they're guaranteed to get a spot every other year. And it's not a therapeutic camp. I mean, I'm of the belief that all type of play, of course, is therapeutic for kiddos. But it's not the intention of it being therapy. The whole purpose around the camp is that kids can go there and be kids. And so those kiddos that are 8 years old and no one in their class knows that their parent died from cancer, all of a sudden can start having a food fight or having color wars with food coloring, and do archery and go swimming with over 150 kids whose parents also have cancer or have died from cancer. And that's a national organization. So if you're working with families or have family members that are otherwhere in the country, it's national, and it's put on through universities and colleges. And this year, CU Boulder is doing it all online, of course, because of the current restrictions. And then lastly, there's the Second Wind Fund of Boulder County, which provides counseling services for at-risk adolescents who have suicidal ideation, and that's offered at no cost as well. And typically the kiddos can access that through their school counselors, but I believe that Boulder Community Hospital is also serving as a reference or referral for that. So it's not uncommon for teenagers and even younger kiddos to have that suicidal ideation come up after the death, whether it's magical thinking of wanting to be with their special person or be with their person, or if it's the maladaptive coping where their feelings are just so big and feel like no one understands that they want to hurt themselves. So I think that's an important, valuable resource.
That's very helpful, Brian. Appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'll unmute everybody so that people can add their comments if they have some.
Did your friend Paul leave? I couldn't find him.
Paul's not on the chat anymore. No.
He's from Texas.
I can tell you about him offline if you'd like.
So Brian, I've worked primarily with adults, so I really appreciated the variety of examples you gave for working concretely with children and their emotions and feelings.
Thank you. I'm
Hi,
glad it
my
was
name is
helpful.
Candace Dorado. I am a therapist in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I work with 0 to 6-year-olds doing child-parent psychotherapy. And I did have one client whose brother passed away as an infant, and all of this information has been extremely helpful and very applicable in the setting that I work with, doing attachment-based work. So I just want to say thank you for providing the information and also the interventions as well.
Great. Oh, Candace, I'm so glad you're able to join in. Thank you for being with us. And I'm glad it was helpful too.
Any other comments? Otherwise, we can close a little early.
The training of this virus has been that we can connect from all over the world now on these kind of forums. And I think that's pretty amazing. Yeah, I really liked what Brian said. I guess what I put in the chat was people use this terminology of passing rather than death. And I don't understand that. I've never understood that. And lately, within the last month, I heard someone else say that same thing. They said, passing is something you do in the hallway.
Yeah.
I'll make a comment that our next interface and also Robin's following is all continuing this theme of dealing with death. And we're going to have an interesting panel talking about ways of dying, or how people can choose to leave their body, or how in different cultures, in different contexts, people face death and address death. And so we didn't intentionally set it up this way, but it just worked out that way with speakers' schedules. So we have these next 3 months focusing on this theme.
Can I ask one more question before we start going away? Sorry to interrupt you, Barry.
Go ahead.
Brian, I was just thinking about a mom that I worked with who, she had, I don't know, 3 or 4 kids, but one of them drowned. And do you ever come to a situation where the parents, this is relevant to what I asked before, but you kind of give up on the mom being able to help the kids because the mom can't help the kids. I wonder, have you had that experience? Do you, I guess you try to bring in other resources, or?
Yeah, it can be so hard. It's finding other ways to support the family in the community and know that the mom's process, is individual to her, and hanging in there with them.
Yeah. So you could just would you meet with the mom and the kids?
It depends what the situation was like specifically and what they were, wanting to get out of it. If I was working with the kiddo and I saw that there was, a big rupture in the communication, or how, mom was supporting the kiddo, I would just meet with the parent for that psychoeducation and offer them like all the reasons why it could be helpful. And I don't know, the specifics of this, and I want to keep it confidential, of course, too. But if she's withholding information about the drowning, that might be really important for the kiddo. Or even letting, if mom is holding a lot of emotion in and just isn't able to model that for the kiddo, I'd be working with the kiddo to go through and explore their own feelings and experiences. And then in sharing what the interventions were with mom, hoping that that might also plant a seed for her. So I might say, if it's a teenager, we're working on a playlist of all different songs that, the person can play when they're feeling sad or angry or, feeling good. And then that might just plant the seed for mom for one day, like, okay, yeah, that's right. Like music can help me. Or
okay, thank you.
Like you said about Lincoln.
yes, yeah. And that's my own personal, that's where my, I'm a music person, so I go towards that a lot.
I wonder about use of, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was wondering about our use of the word passing and gone as euphemisms because we're not comfortable dealing with death in our culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And gone, especially too, is so hard for kiddos because that, it might feel concrete to us, where as adults, we're like, oh, they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
But then that 5-year-old is like, okay, cool. When are they coming back?
Or where did they go?
Yeah. Where do they go? And, even for as they get older too, it can feel invalidating.
My
Just like-
brother went to Naropa. My mom died when he was 5, and my dad told him she was on a vacation. My brother, as a result, went into, I think, really, went into psychotherapy. I mean, to be a psychotherapist, partially because of this, probably. But he's very open now to everything. We don't even have to talk. We get each other. But even though we went through that,
Yeah.
of thinking she just went on holiday.
I'm so glad you have that connection with one another.
Yeah.
Brian, I had a question. Sorry to interrupt.
No, okay.
If someone's coming in for like a sudden death loss to therapy pretty quickly after it, is there anything specific in working with that stage of the process?
Great question. I always go back to the idea of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and just grounding.
Yeah.
And getting things safe and secure and helping figure out what needs to be taken care of. And for some people, that process, can take 3 months, 6 months, or a year even. And then once those things are secure and feel like things are taken care of and stable, then the processing can occur. And that's, I think, the idea too of like the snail mail right now, or sending things to people, is that so often in those first 3 months, 3 to 6 months, there's so much going on of belongings and taking care of bills, and even like social media accounts. Like, oh crap, we got to get in touch with like Facebook to deactivate or turn this into a memorial account. There's so many things that need to get taken care of. And then all of a sudden 3 or 6 months go by and other people in that person's life, you know, going back to their typical routine. But then all of a sudden this person's like, oh my gosh, this is the first Halloween that's coming up without my person. And then that's when things can get really big. And what I've often heard from adults is that the second year is harder than the first. Because the first year has that like expectation of like, okay, this is the first winter holiday, or this is the first 4th of July without the person. We know this is going to be hard. It's a grief wave we see coming. Let's prepare for it. But then all of a sudden, the second year or the third, it's like, oh, wait a minute. This is how it's going to be now forever. Was that answering what you were asking?
Yeah, that's great. And especially with you giving that timeline too around like, oh, it might actually be a year before some of the processing happens.
And especially now too, if that's happening specifically now, I mean, there's so many things that we can't do and take care of, like logistically.
Mm-hmm.
Even adults can have that feeling of, you know, my spouse is going to come back, you know, like it's a business trip or something. And it can take a few months to get beyond that.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and even
years and decades too, where there might be a time when someone hears footsteps outside of their apartment that sound exactly like those footsteps, exactly at that time when that person came home. And I've heard that all of a sudden the heart jumps. And there's almost like the punch to the gut of like, oh my gosh, is that? And then, yeah.
What about not saying anything? Like this case with Boulder High where the kid, I don't know if that was a suicide. I don't think they know anything. The parents weren't saying anything. The police weren't saying anything. The social media wasn't saying anything. And the kids were talking to him. This is just like what you were talking about, Loretta. We're chatting with him and having a great interaction just days before. And then suddenly,
yeah.
What I guess that, I mean, when the kid is dead, he can't even console his friends. And the family and the others that are left can't do anything. And the, you know, the, like the confusion and the mystery of that
Yeah.
is in the whole community and magnifies, you know, cascades through the whole community.
Yeah.
As a vision of what death means versus, you know, Kubler-Ross and others that, and you know, Ram Dass that have brought us to the understanding that we're all connected, you know, through time, space, through all that we perceive as reality when we're quote unquote dead. It's not a bad thing. It's not something that means you need to go out and do it because you are here and you're, you know, you're navigating it. And how you can best navigate it for other folks too. I don't know what you would say to the parents or the media or the other people involved. I'm sure you encounter that a lot in your work, where it's just left.
It's the suffering.
But you know, this is what we're experiencing now with COVID. It's just a sudden, and it's, there is no control. There is, even if you know, even if you could know, there's there's even isolating yourself.
Mhm.
You can get, it's in the jet stream, and you can go outside and breathe it, you know, and shouldn't that present for us the opportunity and the preciousness of life as we know it? And an appreciation for every breath. Ironically, it's the virus that takes our breath away. We drowned, you know, because the alveoli get congested with fluid.
Mhm.
It's so ironic that the very air we breathe is threatened. And what a gift it is to be able to take one breath.
It really speaks to how everything is so interconnected right now. And part of that interconnection is not knowing. And there's a lot of mystery.
And maybe you can be okay with the not knowing.
Mm. It's a lifetime practice for sure.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I've been reciting with some of my clients that carries with Lynn's point about the community and the effect in the bigger picture. We have this technology that we're using right this very moment to stay connected, and contrasting that with in history where there was no phones or TV or television or ways to communicate, where people, as you know, in different pandemic situations, plague, how much suffering there must have been without being able to stay in touch or even find out what's going on. So I wonder, Brian, online, I know there's memorial websites where are set up by various organizations where people can write comments and reflect and post pictures. And I know Facebook sometimes is used that way when someone passes. I know for myself, among the Facebook friends I have, many of them are deceased, and people still wish them a happy birthday on their birthday date if their profiles are still up.
Yeah.
So is there anything in particular that you've come across with children or with families in this regard as a resource for community grieving or acknowledging a death for the child, in the child's benefit, to see that family members are also there for them in some way? Is that something that?
Yeah, I think in many ways it's up to the family to, or someone in the system to start that and initiate that. But there is that United in Grief event that's happening tonight through Judy's House, where people can be connected on social media with that. But I don't know of any other specific intentional things that are happening right now.
Could you say something more about Judy's House, how that got started, or what is that all about?
Yeah, so that was an organization that was founded by Brooke and Brian Keating, and it's a nonprofit that supports, children and families that have been impacted by a death loss. And they have volunteer programs. So you can come in as a volunteer and be a volunteer for the children's bereavement groups. And then they also take on interns, postgraduate trainees, and then, of course, the staff, grief members and grief counselors. And Judy's House is kind of the part that does the clinical work. And then JAG Institute does a lot of research and evaluation on programming for grieving children and families. And that's where the childhood bereavement estimation model came out of.
And I think you told me before we started that you were an affiliate, or you're on their provider list.
Yes, so they have an in-house curriculum-based program that they use specifically for grieving children and families called Pathfinders, where it's a 10-week group program that can also be adapted to individual work. And right now for the organization, all of those materials are in-house, and they're working to get it to be distributed on a wider level. But for therapists or clinicians who have been trained in that, either as a post-grad intern or staff member, or through one of their trainings, then you're authorized to use that out in the community. So I'm affiliated with them as a past staff member, and I'm able to use that curriculum with either children individually or siblings or families.
Thanks. And I should say, if anyone wants to get in touch with you after this, are you willing to consult or be available? Take referrals? Are you, say something about your practice right now?
Yes, yeah. So I'd love to connect with people if there's additional questions, or if I can consult, or yeah, however, if you just want to get in touch and say hi, that's cool too. So my website is deeplisteningpsychotherapy.com. And then my email is brian@deeplisteningpsychotherapy.com.
And we have those links also on the interface webpage.
Oh, great.
That will stay up as well. Hey, Jed, I'm curious if you have any comments from your perspective in your practice, in your role as a psychiatrist. Did you ever work with families with kids in this regard? How have you been listening in on this?
Yeah, and I also have a stepdaughter whose father died when she was 6, and you heard from Helene about that. So, but she's now 26, so I know some about what she went through. One of the things that I was thinking was along the lines of what Brian was saying about the waves, and I've been kind of impressed by people sort of going through waves of grief, and that it sort of comes and then goes, and nobody's in it, especially older people, sort of 100% of the time. Most people can sort of put it down for a little while or pay attention to something else, but then it comes back in a kind of a wave. And my experience is that the waves initially are really high waves and close together, and it's sort of like being on the ocean in a hurricane, and that over time the waves get a little smaller and they get further apart, and there might be a rogue wave now and then, like they have in the ocean, that's a big wave for no particular reason, but that kind of model seems to apply, and people can kind of relate to that and know when they're going through a wave. And you can make lots of metaphors about being able to grab your surfboard and ride that wave, or however you can sort of deal with it and know that it's a expected experience, but that it has its limitation, and that you will get through that particular wave and get back to smoother seas.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks. I just want to say that as a soft opening here, everyone, that Jed has joined us, the Interface Board of Directors, along with Rich Williams and Dawn Taylor. So I appreciate, Jed, you stepping in, and we haven't officially announced it, but glad that you're here.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, see if I can be helpful.
Thumbs up. Yay.
Okay.
I'm so glad that Interface made this available for being online, and offering me the opportunity to come be with you all and be in this dialogue. This was wonderful.
And thank you so much. This has been very helpful to me, and hopefully to many other people that have been on. And it is being recorded. Not sure exactly how we're going to get it posted, but we're going to make it available somehow. Two commercials. One is to zoom in next month, when we have Kim Mooney and her panel with a variety of other people, and their topic is dying with choice, leaving your body behind, as I mentioned earlier. And once again, we're still encouraging people to make donations through our webpage to donate to Boulder Community Health Foundation. I'll put up that screen one more time, I suppose. Let me get it there. That has information on where you can make a donation. I set up this tinyurl.com/donate to the interface. It's a little easier to remember than this link down below. And it'll be posted on our webpage as well. So perhaps this is a good time to thank you again, Brian, and
you.
welcome everyone to come back again next month. So thank you so much. This was a great presentation.
Thanks.
Welcome. Thanks, y'all.
Great.
Thank you.
Good to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.